Today we're looking at Cisco 3550 series switches, some enterprise networking gear from the early 2000s. These represent a time when enterprise networking was transitioning from 100 megabit to 1 gigabit speeds, so we'll get them connected together using Cisco's proprietary GigaStack modules. With the GigaStack links in place, we should be able to create a cluster and see pixel art versions of these switches show up in the Cisco Cluster Management Suite. Let's get into it. This is a Cisco Catalyst 3550 series switch from the early 2000s. Specifically, this is a WS3550-24 that denotes the 24 fast Ethernet ports on the front here, but we've also got something interesting, 2 gigabit capable ports on the right here. These two ports here take GBIC modules, or Gigabit Interface Converter modules. Modules such as this 1000 base ZX fiber module here have EEPROMs on board which can let the switch know about the module's capabilities. GBIC was eventually eclipsed by SFP, or Small Form Factor Pluggable, and in fact you're probably even familiar with the modern SFP Plus modules. The modularity of these is quite interesting because this means you can support different capabilities in a single GBIC slot. For example, I have a 1000 base ZX module here which can support gigabit Ethernet over fiber up to 43 miles or 70 kilometers. This 1000 base SX module over here supports distances much lower than the other one, and of course would have been cheaper. So companies are able to choose what they need for their particular setup and only pay as much as they need to. So why am I here droning on and on about yet another Ethernet form factor? Well, because of these Cisco GigaStack modules. The 3550 series has some tricks up its sleeve in the form of these GigaStack modules, which lets you interconnect switches over a gigabit link over what at the time was a relatively inexpensive option. These have 2 connectors on their edge for cables. You're supposed to order special cables from Cisco, but if I'm being honest, these just look like FireWire ports. But this was an interesting move from Cisco. Fiber GBIC modules at the time averaged from 400 on up in the early 2000s, based on the distances you needed. These things were coming out in 1999 for $250. Really cheap gigabit interconnectivity. You could of course do this just over regular Ethernet and cascade the switches like that, but I think Cisco offered this as sort of a cheaper option to make a few of their switch series a little more desirable. I've got a whole pile of these for us to play with today, but of course that's not going to be very interesting without more switches. I've got a pair of these 3550s. This one had a little shipping issue maybe. I know this one works. Haven't powered this one on yet. We're going to obviously get these stacking with the GigaStack, and I've got some other stuff to help us take it a little bit further. This is a 1 gig aggregation switch in the 3550 series. So we'll be doing all sorts of explorations. You can get these things in the switches and just cascade them that way over 1 gigabit links. But I believe you can start doing point-to-point connections. And if you connect directly to the aggregation switch or just these 2 switches directly, that's probably what we'll try. You can get 2 gig connectivity. Even more impressive. Here's those cables. They have Cisco part numbers, but yeah, they look an awful lot like FireWire cables to me. If this site doesn't pique your interest, like, I don't know what to tell you. I've got all sorts of fiber modules and the cables that will hopefully work for those. The whole goal today is to operate these as one stack with the GigaStack links, get some other stuff hooked up to them, hopefully over fiber, maybe a router, and use something called the Cisco Cluster Management Suite. The 3550 series and a couple other series used that software. Now, I'm not saying that's how a real administrator would use these, but I mean, I got to check this out. It's hosted right on the 3550. You use this as sort of like the base switch and the rest of the cluster connects to it and they all talk to each other. Should be really interesting. Also, when I'm talking about FireWire, I'm just saying it's the same connector. I realize these probably aren't FireWire cables. I don't even know if FireWire was fast enough back when they were using this big connector. Some very brief history on these things. So the 3550 series started just as one 12-port aggregation switch, I think, back in like 2001, based on the Cisco website. About a year later, they started calling everything a series, the 3550 series, and that leads into these models we've got here. It was sort of positioned as slightly higher end than the 2900, slightly more capable, had a lot more management software. And in fact, if I'm reading the documentation correctly, some of the 2900 series, like this XL, can actually stack together and be managed in the software. So we'll probably have to try that too. But I'm going to clear this off and get us down to the 3550. We'll start with that, and that'll be our software host. Both of these were very generously donated by a viewer and patron named Brooke. So Brooke, thank you very much. As always, I believe I'm the second owner, so these had a nice long service life. Got our console cable coming off the back here, into a USB adapter. Got my clever little USB port going into my main machine over there. Got our console terminal here. Let's give it some power. It's a little sign of life there on the terminal. So again, I have booted this one up before. Factory reset it in a Patreon video. Made sure it was probably good enough for this video. We're going to set it up together. Again, totally factory reset switch. So let's get into privilege mode, no password. And I can go to configure the terminal. And what we want to do is turn on the internal management HTTP server so that we can see what type of web management stuff this thing already has. We do that with IP HTTP server. Then we're going to configure the management VLAN. I'm going to give it an IP address. Don't know if I need to do a default gateway, but do it anyway. Let's hook this thing up to a Windows XP VM and see if we can see it. This is the wrong Windows XP VM that I pulled up. I wonder what I was up to. This is the right VM. Let's see if we can ping the switch. We can. Perfect. See if we can hit it in a browser. I'm just going to hit it at port 80. Here it is. So you can see I've been here before. It's kind of interesting. This is like the very basic setup you get. So we can look and see that VLAN 1 is up. Some hardware information. And it's just spitting it out. There's this thing called Web Console, which 404s. So we're going to have to do something about that. We need a different version of iOS on there. But it's pretty interesting. Like, does this work? Yeah, we got a ping tool. There is a much more sophisticated cluster management suite that I need to get installed on this thing. But first, I need to get this thing out of the room. I'm going to give you a clip of that without any noise canceling. It's got to go. Okay, it's over in the other room, living in its new home. Remember how we try to get to the web console UI and it just doesn't work? It's a 404. This is because the router is configured to use a version of iOS that's not hosting these files. Let me explain. Here I'm on the switch, and if I take a look at show version, we get some information. I'm pointing at system image file flash. This whole thing. Cisco has, in my opinion, confusing file names if you're not familiar with them, and they've changed the format over the years. These 3550s shipped with two different versions, something called SMI and EMI. EMI stands for Enhanced Multi-Layer Software Image. SMI stands for Standard Multi-Layer Software Image. Basically, SMI has less features, less layer 3 features than an EMI version. In fact, on the back of my units, you can see they were factory shipped with SMI. Not too big of a deal for us, but is another layer of confusion on top of this whole thing. Even worse, or maybe better for consumers, the SMI builds got better over time. They started getting more layer 3 features as time went on. On these 3550s, the version of iOS that you're running is stored in Flash. iOS stands for Inter-Network Operating System Software. It's what you're looking at here. It's what's running on these switches and actually does all the networking work. And if you've ever wondered, how did Apple get away with calling their stuff iOS? Well, they didn't. They paid Cisco for the right to do it. So that's probably been a nice revenue income stream for Cisco. If you issue a dir ? Command, it'll show you all the devices it thinks it knows about. Cisco likes to use colons in the device name, so that'll really catch you up. You'll come over here and say dir flash, and it'll say, I don't know what you're talking about. It needs to be dir flash : And in here, we can see some old configs and everything. And from our show version, we know we're pointing at this guy. You can see there's another iOS sounding name up here, and it happens to be a directory. And if we take a look inside, it's got a bin inside and an HTML directory. So I'm pretty sure this is some version that has what we need on it. We're going to tell the router to boot off of this and see where that gets us. Otherwise, we'll just throw a new version on here. So I'm telling it to boot system flash, that folder name, and the bin we saw in there. And now I'm reloading the switch, and we'll see if we boot into the other version of iOS. I don't really care what it is. I just wanted to have the Cluster Management Suite hosted. It seems to be booting to that new one. You can see we've got this subfolder business going on here. So, well, it's not new, but we'll see. It should be iOS 12.2. That's what the 122 means, 12.2. Yeah, a slightly newer version than what we were running. The other one was a bin from 04. This one's from 06. This switch does a lot of testing, by the way. I'm sure you can configure how rigorous it is, but kind of nice. We're up, no problems. It's running the one we told it to run. And this is a PowerPC processor. Kind of cool. The moment of truth. What will we see here? Nothing different. Okay. Yeah, this is a little different than what we were seeing before. Let's see here. Device Manager will not run with the 06. What IE version was out during that? This is IE7. Let's see if it works. Cisco Device Manager. Okay. Very interesting. So this is not the device management software I'm looking for, but it's pretty close. Yeah, we have a view of the switch. It knows what it's up to. Well, maybe this is good enough. There's so many different device management UIs and GUIs that Cisco has made over the years. I might have to get an older version of iOS on here because I really want to see the old cluster management software. Let's fire up that other switch and then GigaStack it with this one. Just see what it does. See how hard it is to use. This one is in a little rougher shape than the other one, so we're going to give it a little wipe down here. Yeah. And in fact, I'm just noticing it shipped with iOS version 12.1, so that's kind of interesting. We might need to go older than that for that cluster management stuff. The stack is growing. Okay, that other switch is up and healthy. It's running a very similar, if not the same bin that the other one originally had been. And if we dir flash again, we have yet another old one floating around. This one much closer in age to the bin that's currently running on the thing and the original one from the other switch. And remember, the way this is set up, you can either run directly from a bin or it can be a folder containing the iOS version information along with the bin inside that, and then HTML. This HTML looks quite a bit different, and I'm seeing CMS references in there. So maybe 2004-ish is old enough to have the cluster management software. Let's point this thing at that just to see. Just for some context, on these 3550 series of switches, Cisco would release a .bin file of the iOS. You could just run that directly if you wanted. Some of mine were doing that. Or they would release a .tar archive file, kind of like a zip folder, containing the .bin of the iOS version and an HTML folder hosting the assets we're seeing in the browser. I didn't show this very well last time, but you do configure terminal, and then you can say boot system flash, and then the path of the file you'd wish to boot at. In our case, it's that folder containing that bin file. I think we write that out and then do a reload. Booting up to the one we pointed at inside that folder. Perfect. Yeah, this might be what we want. A version from 2003. We might use this as the host server and then cluster to it or something. It's the same story as before. We need to turn on the HTTP server, give this thing a IP address for us to talk to it in the Windows XP VM. If you're wondering if I remember all these IPs I randomly set on all my devices, I don't. I go back and watch these YouTube videos. I need to go plug that thing in. There is something so funny to me about including this little crappy Cisco switch in the mix when I'm networking this ridiculously expensive enterprise equipment from the 2000s. Let's see if we can talk to the second switch. Filling the ARP tables? Maybe? Uh-oh. Okay, this switch is partially configured. The fast Ethernet port 1 I just plugged into that you saw me do that already had an IP assigned, so I just need to clear that or swap where the cable is, basically. Swap the cable. Round 2. Hang tight for round 3. Something about bringing that other switch online onto the network has broken my ability to talk to the first switch. It was at .50, if you remember, and I can't communicate with it anymore, so gonna have to think about that. Okay, some frantic Googling. We're back now. I can ping the first switch. I can ping the second switch. What I had to do was configure port 1, the port I'm using, to access VLAN 1, switch access VLAN 1. I needed to do this on both switches. In the moment of truth, if we go to the second router's page, what is it going to show us? Web console. Oh yeah, CMS will start momentarily. Oh yes. This one has the Cluster Management Suite. We might need the plugin. Oh, it's going. It's going. Grant always. Oh yeah. Here we go. Yes. We'll look at device management system another day. This is what we're here for. Cluster management. Look at this Java applet. This is beautiful. So now the question is, can we create a cluster with this one and add the other one without changing iOS versions? Will it just accept whatever's on that one? So the next day, I spent last evening reading about Cisco Cluster Management from the early 2000s, you know, as one does. I'm not sure I learned anything, but we're going to try creating a cluster. Let's call it the Clab cluster. Okay, this guy is what's called the command switch. It's running the host software that's, you know, doing all this, and it's going to look for member switches. You can change the mode of the UI to guide or expert. I am not an expert, so guide mode. And I think it like tries to make things easy for you as you're moving through if it has a guide mode. Okay, so theoretically, we should be able to go to add to cluster, and it's going to kind of look on the network and try to find things it can add. And our other switch is called switch. So let's try adding it. Okay. Wow. Yes. Okay. This is the stack we have in the other room. This one's running a different software version and in fact isn't even hosting the CMS. So I was just genuinely curious about how in sync those things needed to be. Doesn't seem like they need to be. Let's go over to topology view. We've got our command switch and it knows about the other one. Okay. This is working, but we're not gigastacked. So I'm going to totally rebuild all of this. Let me show you what I'm thinking. Brought everything back in here so I could explain it better. I'm going to factory reset these two guys. We're going to rename everything. We're going to see if this works, I guess. And I'll talk you through the network. So on VLAN 1, for all of these, we're going to set up a management network on 192.168.2. And it's my understanding that you should not use VLAN 1 ever. Everyone kind of expects you to, and if you don't have your security just right, everyone's kind of looking at VLAN 1 and looking for you, so don't do that, but I'm pretty safe down here. In fact, we won't even have a router at first, and certainly not an internet connection. We're going to give these guys some beautiful names. Switch 1, Switch 2, and egg. This will be 192.168.2.10, 11, and 12. This one down here with our shipping issue, we know has the right version of CMS, the software. I'm not going to mess with that because whatever version of Java I have on that Windows XP VM loves it, so everything was going good. We're just going to stick with that. I'm going to factory reset this, get everything the way we want, and then we'll dive in and look at this guy. In terms of interconnectivity between all these, will of course be GigaStacking. So we'll have a module here, we'll have a module here, I'll put a module in port 1 over here, and one in port 2 over here. These will be interconnected pretty much as you're expecting, and will officially be gigastacked. Now, if this video doesn't become too long, we'll have some bonus content in the form of this gigabit capable router, a Cisco 7200 series VXR, and on the back, we've got an MPE G1. This thing can do gigabit Ethernet, and it even has GBIC ports, and maybe we will gigastack it in there. This VXR router is not going to show up in the stack. That software doesn't understand this thing. But theoretically, as I understand it, this older Catalyst 2900 series XL switch should show up in the stack. So maybe we'll throw that in the mix as well. Well, there's no sense in dealing with the other switches until I know this aggregation switch is working. And it is really, really dirty. The air vents on the front are totally full of gunk. So we're going to have to clean that. To be fair, the eBay listing showed this and I rolled the dice. This thing has the very classic Catalyst affliction of you look at it and all its plastic parts just fall apart. So that's fine. We'll get all this cleaned up and boot her up. A before shot for you there. This thing saw a lot of action. Well, I think you'll agree, just by running it under some water, it cleaned up beautifully, except the plastic posts that are supposed to be holding that faceplate in also literally disintegrate underwater along with the dust, so that's unfortunate. And this thing's got a bunch of plastic rattling around inside of it. I suspect it's more of these feet. This thing's rolling around, so I think we'll try to open it up. I also want to open it up because it is significantly physically larger than the 24 port switches here. I guess there's a lot of electronics involved in these GBIC connectors. We'll see. It's just a few flatheads around the perimeter of the case, which is typically the situation with Cisco gear. You can take it apart, but not always. You can't take apart that VXR. Looks like this slides back for us, like so. Interesting, like foam baffle on there. That'll be a nightmare in 10 more years. This fan and power supply assembly angles up for some reason. This is a super weird setup. Yeah, it's not too bad in here. These clips are what were rattling, as suspected. It's just got tons of Cisco branded chips inside, along with a very elaborate compass rose. Any Cisco employees know what that's about? I'm not finding anything alarming in here other than a reasonable amount of dust. Those other two switches had two of these turbine or whatever these are style fans. So this thing will be nice and loud. And it's going to smell quite good, I'm sure. Okay, here's the physical stack setup we've got going on. Everything is in a star formation, meaning the two switches are going into the egg switch on direct links. You could also do this in a cascading fashion. I don't really have enough here to make that interesting to experiment with, so we're just going to go with the superior star configuration because I have the egg switch anyway. You can see the Windows XP VM is sneaking in to port 12 on the egg switch. And Cisco outdid themselves. There are activity lights on the GigaStack modules. Gotta love it. Off camera, I just did a very minimal configuration after factory resetting everything. I gave everything the right host name. I gave every VLAN 1 on each switch the right IP. On the command switch, I turned on the HTTP server again, and that's pretty much it. No other configuration. I came in here and made Clab Cluster. Just like last time, we've got switch 1 and switch 2 as members. And if we go over to cluster, add to cluster, we can see the aggregation switch here. And you don't actually have to use the UI to do this. So here I am on the command switch, switch 1, and I can actually do show cluster. And it knows that this is the command switch for Clab Cluster, and it has 2 members at the moment. And I think we can also do a show cluster candidates. And look at that, it knows about AG1. Speaking of AG1, if I go take a look at it, a show cluster here won't say anything because it doesn't know anything about it. But you might be wondering, how are these things talking to each other? It's the Cisco Discovery Protocol, or CDP. I can say show CDP neighbors, or neighbors if you type it wrong. Anyway, show CDP neighbors, and it can go off and figure out that it's got switch 1 and switch 2 that it knows about, and you can ask for further detail. You can find out IP addresses if they have any, the version of iOS that each switch is running. Super fascinating, but we're not here for the CLI. Let's add egg to our cluster. Apply. Takes about 20-30 seconds. I cut that out. And there it is. Egg. Look at that. This is so cool. I don't know how to tell you this, but we are officially gigastacked, and we've got a pretty good cluster going. Who needs Kubernetes? This is pretty nice. It's got a little piece of art for the GigaStack modules and knows which port is busy. It of course knows that we've got the XP VM sitting over here. Now let's see how hard it is to get that 2900 XL as part of our Clab cluster stack here. Okay, I want to get this thing in the stack and see if the cluster management system can find it. But I also want to factory reset it, so we need to go on a little side quest. I've actually been accessing the console port of those switches over my network with something called a secure console server. Mine is from MRV. It's always on. It's in the rack. It's from the early 2000s. I love this thing. I've raved about it a bunch. It's got this fantastic Java UI to interact with it. The only problem is it's got RJ45 ports on the back, and they have a non-standard pinout. I've been using these real nice cables I made a long time ago that convert that pinout to a standard, serial RS-232 or something. And I only have 2 of these, and I'm about to have 4 switches in there. So off camera, I'm gonna whip up a couple custom cables that go from the MRV pinout to the Cisco pinout, so I don't have to worry about this thing anymore. Okay, got a couple of these made up. Really happy with that. I put this yellow tape on the Cisco side in a feeble attempt to remind myself what these are for, because otherwise they just look like normal Cat6 cables, of course. Just tested them, they work great. I have an open RJ45 port on the egg switch, but I also have a pile of these 1000 base T GBIC modules. So we're going to throw one of these in the aggregation switch. We'll see if it's going to auto-negotiate down to the 100 megabit that this 2900 is going to use. Here is everything stacked up. We're going to plug the 2900 XL in. I've got port 1 connected to port 3 on the egg switch with that 1000 base T GBIC module. Let's see what we get. I have been doing battle with this thing for the last hour and a half. You can see it's back in here now. Problem number 1, I can't connect to it over that MRV secure console I was just raving about. Nothing works. I have to have it locally here next to my machine. Never had a device that didn't work, so frustration number 1. Brought it back in here. Could not get this thing to connect up to those 3550 series switches. Tried all sorts of configuration, setting the switch port mode, different cables, putting other devices in between. Tried connecting this to the gigabit switch. Tried connecting this to 100 megabit ports on the other 2 switches. Tried changing the speeds, forcing the duplex. Nothing. And of course, Mark from the serial port to the rescue, as usual. I needed a crossover cable. So I've got the world's smallest crossover cable here. And you can see, got a green link light between this and the aggregation switch. It was so much work to get here. I couldn't even see any link connectivity at all, which should have been screaming to me, crossover cable. So let's get this back in the stack and see if the software will see it. Probably what's going on is we're missing auto MDIX somewhere in the equation, which would have rendered the crossover cable unnecessary. But at any rate, here's the setup. You can see the crossover cable is going from port 24 on the 2900 XL to port 11 on the aggregation switch. I could not get these gigabit GBIC modules to work with it, even with the crossover cable, and at this point, I don't care. I'm at the console of our command switch, switch 1, and we can say a show cluster candidates, and it sees it. I named that thing switch 3. It's the 2924 XL. That's the exact device name there. So let's see if the cluster management software sees it. We got to make this bigger. Room for our new friend. Cluster, add to cluster. There's switch 3. Let's apply. Sees it in the list. Oh yeah, there it is. Love it. This is so good. This thing has a bunch of physically broken ports. iOS complains about them. I already knew that, but I'd never used it in any other capacity, so I was getting pretty suspicious when I couldn't get this thing to work until I figured out the crossover cable with the tip from Mark. Another interesting thing, you can virtually press the button on the front of the switch to cycle between modes. You can see the lights changing. Every profession or industry has some sort of art they're producing, I think. The switches, a lot of the time, are the industrial design, the physical design of the switch. A lot goes into that. But this has to be an aspect. Like some Cisco designer or developer sat down and they made pixel art, quasi-pixel art renditions of a bunch of Cisco switches. Like, look at that. It does not get any better than this. I'm so satisfied. Well, that stack of switches isn't all that interesting without a router to get it to the outside world. But I think that'll be in a follow-up video. I could hook this up and get it routing to the internet or whatever, but that's not all that interesting. Don't forget to subscribe. We've got more network content coming, some of this fiber GBIC stuff, and maybe some home lab dial-up. If you really want to support the channel, I've got a Patreon where I post behind-the-scenes type content and some sneak peeks into ideas for videos I'm cooking up. I hope you enjoyed watching and following along, and that I at least convinced you a little bit that these GUIs behind this enterprise networking gear are pretty interesting because I don't think a ton of people used them in practice, but clearly a lot of effort and thought and development hours went into it. And if you made it this far, I also wanted to thank you. I just got a new camera that I'm learning how to use, and so this video maybe was a little bit clunky. It's a very good camera, but I think we've got some skill issues to work through. The videos will continue to improve, the audio, everything. Thanks for watching, and I hope I see you in the next one.